Hi folks. On my once-in-a-lifetime US road trip, I visited a former QL trader in Indiana. I last met him about 23 years ago, and for about 2 decades I was aware that he is having some really very rare gems in terms of Sinclair QL computing. And at his home we went through his boxes, and in the end it was about 5 or 6 kilograms of material, a stack of about 30 centimeters, which went on the journey with me in the US and finally got it into the plane and back home to Switzerland. I did not really box it, it was in my luggage, so it's not a typical unboxing video, but I will show you piece by piece and tell you a little bit the story about it. To do so, I prepared a shelf here where I have my Sinclair museum. You see that's the Spectrum side, and that's the QL and Z88 side. And okay, let's start. So first is what looks like a Sinclair QL computer. So let's get rid of the bubbles, and now we can see it. It's really a QL computer in its beauty, and this machine is kind of special. So first you see that here there is some plastic damage, which looks like it has a damage from the inside. Then when you turn it to the back side, you see that there are no openings for air circulation on top of the case. Other than that, it looks pretty much like a regular UK version of the QL. But when you have a look at the serial number, you see that's a D03 build standard. That's pretty early, and the serial number is 1123, and Sinclair normally started with 1000, so this is machine 123 ever made. So this is a pretty early machine, and we opened it at his place, and I was aware, and he was aware, that it has a firmware in EPROMs, not in ROMs. And the firmware version of this beauty is PM. That was long lost, and now with the find of this machine we were able to re-release the firmware version PM for the QL. It has QDOS 1.02. So this is a pretty early QL, and I'm really happy to give him a new home. So put the thing on the shelf. Talking about pretty early QLs, I already have another machine for about, don't know, 6-7 years, which has the same case. That means no air openings at the back, and this one is an even earlier build state, so it's a D02 with the serial number 1071, so this is machine 71 ever made. I had this machine for many years, and the point was that it had firmware in ROM, and the reason it has this is because the machine was sent by the customer to Sinclair Research to get the mandatory factory modification and the upgrade of the firmware done. So even this is the earlier machine, the D03 the D03 here, which I now got during my US road trip, is even a rarer beast because it has no modifications made later on, and it still has the original firmware. So how comes that Paul, the QL trader, owns such a English version of the Sinclair QL. Point is that he and his colleague were running a QL trading business called Mechanical Affinity, and they bought the stock and the rights from a company called A+. A+ was a company as a kind of Sinclair distributor in about 1985, 1986. And they bought all the stock from Sinclair Research when they closed the US office in Boston. And this QL came with this lot. And I did even more research, and it looks like that this early QL, so February, March 1984 made, was used to do the Sinclair QL presentation at the Boston Computer Society. That was the presentation which was held by Nigel Searle, and he had a couple of early machines with him which had the firmware in ROM and had the dongle. So the dongle of this machine got lost over the time, but fortunately I had quite a few dongles, and we already saved the portion needed to complete the firmware. So this machine did quite a journey from London to Boston, used maybe only a few hours for presentation and internal work, and then went to the shelf, ended up in a warehouse, got sold to A+, and from A+ to Mechanical Affinity. And Paul told me about in 2001 that he owns this D03 machine, which I now have here in my collection. Good. Then there is another gem coming from the same lot. It was in the same box. This is a unpopulated Sinclair QL motherboard, and even also uncut. That means the PCB is still in the shape as it was produced by the PCB maker, and then the components came on and would have been soldered, and after soldering the PCB will be cut out and tested and then mounted into the case. And here we have some nice writing on the back, handwritten. And what I can see is about 23 2nd 84. That means February 23rd 1984. That's pretty early. That's about 5-6 weeks after the presentation of the QL to the public. And this PCB is issue number 4, and also those two machines here have issue number 4. So now I have 3 motherboards issue number 4. That's amazing, because it was believed for many years, and it's also on Wikipedia and other resources, that all early QLs were dumped. Even when there were some samples around, whenever they were sent to Sinclair for service or mandatory modification or firmware upgrade, it was written, and it was known that the customer received new QLs, but this wasn't true, because this machine here was sent to Sinclair and got the modifications and EPROMs in it, and still has issue 4. So this is really pretty. We put it on the shelf. Talking of uncut motherboards, this is not the first one I have. I have already one in my collection. This is issue 5. And here you see that the components are already on the PCB, and many of them already soldered, but for example keyboard connectors are still missing, and also the connector for the expansion bus is missing. And this maybe was a sample of the soldering production step, or it was a reject, I'm not sure, but at least it didn't went further. There were no cuttings made to the PCB and it was not fully populated. So this I own for about 10 years. I got this, if I remember correctly, from Rich Meller. So this is from my collection already. That was my first uncut motherboard. Then, because 3 is a nice number, I have another one, an uncut, and it's unpopulated. But this one is, as you can see, issue 6. And I have this also for a couple of years. I think I also got it from Rich Meller. And while I was skiing with David Carlin, the chief design engineer who was responsible for the QL chipset and the general QL design, signed me this PCB, so this has a special value for me. So now I own 3 uncut QL motherboards, an issue 4, an issue 5 and an issue 6. Good. What else we have from Paul? I got a bunch of EEPROM chips. He has maybe 100 EEPROMs. We went through a few, saved the binaries, and some of the empty one I took with me because you can never have enough 27512 or 27128 EEPROMs for retro computing. Then here we have another package with chips, and we see that there's a writing on it, Blessé, caution, static sensitive device. While going through all the chips Paul has, and maybe he has several dozens of QL master chips, of peripheral chip or intelligent peripheral controllers, he said, hey Urs, did you see I have some gold-plated ZX 8301, and yeah, what he had were a few of those made by Plessy, CLA 2345, and you see the date code, it's week 43 in 1984. This is in fact the QL's master chip, the so-called ZX 8301. But normally, and beside maybe the marketing brochure of the launch, all the chips I have ever seen are maybe ceramic or plastic, but never gold-plated. And so this looks, even with the red handmade dot, to be like a sample. Because of the date code, this is much, much earlier than any of those CLA 2345. The CLA 2345 was the second edition of the QL's master chip, and it was developed because the QL had problems with FCC and even with the German VDE, and also with the functionality needed for international, like North America or European or Korea. So that's why Sinclair had to go again on the design board and do some changes to the internals of the ZX8301. But it's fully compatible, and even when you have an American machine, you can put in one of the early CLA 2310. Then Paul had a second one, and there is some handwriting on it, ZX8301, very nice. And that reminds me that I have one single QL master chip, which also is gold-plated. I have this from, I remember well, I got this from Tony Firschman in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, and as you can see, It also has a red color dot on it, and I compared it, so from the outside the package looks exactly the same material, the same color. But what is special with this chip, it looks like Tony Fishman had a bunch of those, and because they were pretty nice chips, those ceramic gold-plated with the second edition, he did a modification to the QL, a higher quality quartz, a 15 megahertz, directly glued on the chip, removed one pin and soldered the quartz to the pin. So when you added to your QL this chip, you had much better video picture, much more stable. And on one side it's good, I used this for many years, but as a collector I would love that Tony did not do those modifications and would sell the chips on their own. So, but now it's not the problem, because as you can see, again, the 3 is a very nice number, and I have now 3 pieces of the ZX8301 second edition, also known as CLA 2345. Very nice. So I will not put them back in the Plessy package for the moment. I leave them here and put them on pole stack. Then he of the other chips which he had on stock, I just took 2 ceramic ZX8301 second edition. So that's how the chip was produced in masses. When I talk in masses, I talk of a few 10,000s. And Plessy made them not gold-plated, that's too expensive, but almost all second edition were ceramic for the heat. Okay, 2 chips of those, because with this date code, I went through my file, date code week 47 in 1985. This is the first 2 chips of this batch. So it looks like that for American market, or Samsung as a manufacturer, assembling company, there was a dispatch of that week. Okay, talking of chips, I will show you that that's part of my QL chip collection. I have many more for spares, but those are my reference chips, and you can see that that's the master chip, the ZX8301, and you see that the early ones were in ceramic, and then there were some plastic packages, and okay, I correct myself, even from the second edition here I have a plastic package. That's the peripheral chip, ZX8302. It's only known that there is one edition of that. And this is the IPC, the Intelligent Peripheral Controller. And I was aware that there was one made by NEC and one made by Philips. But the firmware on both is version 0.7. It's written on the chip itself. And I heard once and saw a picture that there is a later version of the firmware made by Sinclair, but I was not sure if it was real existence or if it was just a picture and a report. So probably there is a second firmware edition, original firmware edition of the IPC. Later on, there were many modifications, one called Hermes, which in fact is a rewritten firmware for the same hardware. So those are my chips, my reference chips. I put them on my other QL. And I missed something minutes ago when we talked about the unpopulated motherboard here. We saw the writing on it, and I have a ROM port dongle that comes from that QL, from the serial number 71. Even the customer sent that to Sinclair for upgrades. He kept the dongle at his home because Sinclair was not requesting to get the dongles back, or at least not pushing the customers if they didn't. And I see that the writing on it is exactly the same handwriting. So the same person who was doing some writing on this unpopulated PCB did also the writing on this small dongle. You can clearly see when we go close to the camera that it's exactly the same handwriting. So that comes to my QL. Here we put again the stuff, and back to QL's, back to Paul's stuff. There's another chip, so I took at least 3 of those ceramic. Again, the nice number 3 today. Then Paul had from the job lot, which he got from A+, and which they got from Sinclair, some brand new brochures of Sinclair research, one Sinclair Plaza in Nashua, and the flyer has a statement to the revolution continues, and when you open it you see that's the American flyer or brochure for the QL, and I already had one of those, but not in this pristine condition. And when you look at it from the tech specs, where it's written ROM 48K and the writing of QDOS with DOS as in lowercase, and the price of $499, this looks like about a mid-1984 brochure of the QL. Maybe it's a bit older, maybe it was handed out in Boston in May 1984 when the presentation was held, or it was prepared a few weeks or months later and sent out by mail. The other one I have has a mail address here and was really sent with US postage services. Good. Next is this folder, and inside was looking like a book or a manuscript of a book, but when I went through it, I see that it's copyright 1984 by Forum, Navision Executive Computing and Sinclair Research, and because the contents is not really a contents, it's an agenda with time, like 9 o'clock, 9:20, 10:20, 11, 10, 11:20, 12 o'clock, 12:50, 12:55 and 1 o'clock. It was a kind of a workshop or a seminar about the QL's business software. So probably this was used at the launch in the US, or it was used later on to present the powerful business software which was delivered with the QL. Very nice find. It will definitely get the scan on my HP all-in-one scanner, and will be put on my sinclairql.net website. Then Paul had at least one retail package of 4 Sinclair microdrive cartridges in a pretty nice condition for the age. That's made 1984, 1985, and it's brand new old stock. That means there are brand new microdrive cartridges in it, and the paperwork's here, like the information sheet, the sticker, and the directory notebook is included. And as said, this is brand new, never used, so very nice for my collection, because all the one I had were ones I bought for myself, and which I used, the cartridges and also the papers. So this is very nice. To show you one of mine I already had, looks nice from the front, but on the back there was a sticker for protection in the store, and I bought this in Switzerland, so this was a Swiss retail store, and I copied on those empty cartridges the Psion software version 2.25 in German. So from the front side in the collection it was looking good, but it was already used. Okay, need a little bit to speed up. Next on Paul's stuff, he had still quite a few spare parts, and I took two brand new keyboard membranes with me. Those are the brittle ones, the one made for Sinclair and maybe also for services in the days after Sinclair sold the computing business to Amstrad. So it's always good to have two of those early ones, because they are more original than the clear ones which are in use nowadays. So we do, with the camera I show you what we have left, so there's still some stuff to go. Okay, let's see. Then Paul had this bag full of brand new key tops of the QL, and they are really brand new. You see no dirt on them, and there are even some PN numbers written on the back, so this looks like original spare part supply from Sinclair Research. Also came the same way, Sinclair Research 2A plus, to Mechanical Affinity, and then to me. Then Paul has still some few dozens, if not 100 microdrive cartridges, and I went through them and just took 6 with me. So 2 times 3, again the magic number of today. We'll see if I can read them and if there is some rare files on them. Then again, magic number of 3 today, 3 ROM port dongles made by Care, 2 with the QJump Toolkit 2 on it, and 1 with Idersoft's ICE. And they are not rare, but you can never have enough ROM port dongles to try on 16 kilobyte of expansion firmware on the QL. Then he had some bits and pieces for a 4th dongle, but on the PCB 1 chip is missing. But better than to be thrown away, I took this with me. Now some paperworks, one original QMANA disk drive guide for the QL. Very nicely made, because at that time the QL was still alive, mainstream, 1985. Many companies had great hopes in peripheral business for the QL, and this manual was has been sold together with the drives by Curry Computer, and there is a sticker in it so that the customer is calling Curry and not the UK address. So also a nice find. I have the manual already, but the original with the UK address. Then I was not taking software with me, microdrive cartridge, other than the D06 I showed you. But he had this this paper of Night Flight from Real Time Software. This was in the package behind the clear plastic with the microdrive cartridge, and the price was just below £15 sterling. I'm pretty sure I have the cartridge, and but not the box, and so this is half of the box, and the thing gets more and more complete. Then there is this semi-professional printed manual of metamedia productions of a thing called Q-Link, 1987. So this was after the QL got axed by Amstrad, and so that was in the after official market. And yeah, that's the way I also produced many of my manuals in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Dotmatics printed and then photocopied at the local copy shop. And it looks like this is an American guy who did like an independent label for publishing. Then Paul gave me one of these badges. Paul was running together with his friend of mechanical affinity shows in Indianapolis, and this was the badge for the second Midwest Computer Feast, May 2nd and 3rd, 1987. So Paul really was in charge just months after Sinclair folded. And together with his colleague, they were not only selling goods which were available on the market, they were also producing some hardware, like this is a PCB to be put in the ROM socket of the QL. You put the EEPROM on it with the firmware in it, and you have the possibility to use the Ford 16K of a 27512 EEPROM for a toolkit or something, and then to switch it on and off so that you're still able to use the external ROM port if needed. So this is an early design of this concept, and it's still around nowadays from many others. But Paul did those with his company Mechanical Affinity in the late 1980s, and I got two of them with me. One looks like a kind of a sample, not that nicely soldered, and one which is more looking like a, I call it mass production. So this is maybe second edition or final edition. And they also made a PCB where you could put the battery in on it, and it has some logic on it, so that the peripheral chip of the QL, the ZX8302, which has a real-time clock in it, Sinclair failed to make a perfect design, so they never added the battery to it, but because with spikes and reset, the RTC was reset and lost the date. But with some simple logic, you can make this RTC stable and not losing the data at the reset or power off or at some spikes. And later on, other companies in the UK did a similar design, and basically the know-how was around for quite a while. Good, then I took some more papers with me, and those are papers made by a company called CST, Cambridge System Technology, together with Dansoft, the Danish software company. Those two companies were the drivers behind a computer model or a computer family called the Thor, like the Northern God. And they produced first the regular Thor, which was based on the QL motherboard. But in 1987, they developed the CST 416, which has a brand new motherboards based on the Motorola 68000 at 8 MHz. It has a CPU board with DRAM and video, and has a peripheral board which is also completely different from the original QL. I took those papers with me because I also very much interested in the CST Tor. I was involved in the Tor 16 development. I wrote the user interface for it, but never got paid and never got released. So I used this development to start the product called QTOP. And I own about 3 or 4 CST Tor computers, and I sold some of them during my dealer times. So any paper about those computers are of interest to me. And there's even, and that's not from Paul, that's from my shelf, a CST4 technical guide. And this technical guide was edited and published by myself in about the early 1990s, when CST went out of business and Dansoft also, and there was no support anymore for those machines. So I took all the existing technical information, sorted them, corrected them, added some notes, and published this book. Sold maybe just a couple of them, I think less than 10. And this is one of my, that's my copy to use. And the original I still have is on white paper. I photocopied this on green so that it's not being pirated that easily. So this is my working copy. I will go through Paul's paper and look if they are already in here. Otherwise I will add them to my stack of the original white papers of the technical guide, and maybe do a full scan and publish it on the Sinclair QL.net website. Okay, what else? There is a brochure from the United Kingdom, from CubeSoft. Ron Dannett was running CubeSoft, and I remember that I once supplied some screens, some graphics, and released something called the Covo QL screen collection, and Ron published it as on his public domain catalog, and think the screens were spread a bit. Nowadays the screens are part of QLE and are also part of the distribution. Then there was a point that when I left Paul's place, he sent me an email that he found some more chips, and we ended up that he sent me a package with US Postal Service to a place in Northern California where I stayed at the very end of my US road trip. And he sent me this box, very nice box made by IBM. It's an anti-static box, and inside are some nice finds of Paul, some mainly EPROMs, and I will use my EPROM programmer to read out the binaries of those EPROMs, compare if they are already around. If not, make sure they get published on my SinclairQL.net site, and most likely also on Dilwyn Jones' site, because they are of general interest. And he sent me in this box another IPC of the QL, the Intelligent Peripheral Controller, again with the firmware 0.7, the one which is known, and the chip is in kind of bad condition. The pins are bent. But he had a small bag, and on this small bag it's written updated keyboard chips. Cost $13 US each. So I was looking at the chips, and wow, I was surprised, because you see it's by NEC, and the date code is 1985, week 3. And what I can see here is that IPC1 -2. So my interpretation is that's a later version of the firmware, version 1.2, because the early and the other chips, even the one by NEC, are having a complete different writing. So compare it here. I hope you can see it. So on top we have the the new chip, the upgraded one, where is written 1 minus 2. My interpretation, that's 1.2. And the earlier one, the well-known chip, has 0 minus 7. So that's version 0.7. So I will definitely try those chips in a QL and test for the known IPC box, like do some crazy beeps and see if the keyboard stocks. And yeah, once I've done that, I will definitely report if I found a difference. I will even try to extract the firmware from the chip. Not sure my EEPROM programmer can handle it. I may ask some guys with more hardware knowledge to reread the firmware of the 0.7 chips and of those 1.2 chips. So one day we will know if Sinclair really did a second edition of the IPC. And if that's the case, then Sinclair did pretty well at the end. So second edition of the master chip, well engineered manufacturing at Samsung, complying with FCC and VDE, and a second edition of the intelligent peripheral controller with maybe fixes for serial and keyboard. We'll see. Okay, that was quite a long video, but quite interesting things I took home from the US. And I would like to thank Paul very much for his hospitality, for the great time we've spent together, and for giving me those pieces for a fair price. And I'm now giving all that stuff a new home, and I'm really happy and excited that 2018 was so successful in bringing some very, very rare QL hardware back to life or back to public. Okay, that's it for the moment. And with a view to the Sinclair brochures, I end this video and wish you all the best. Take care and stay tuned.